Part 2, just reading about the Freemasons' plot to corrupt women and thus corrupt the church. We may never know the precise details of Pope Leo's vision, but it surely seems that his concern about the coming difficulties in the church and the world were well-founded. Pope Leo XIII, like many popes before him, spoke out strongly against Freemasonry, socialism, and communism. His wording in the encyclical Rerum Novarum is particularly strong, and his encyclical letter, Humanum Genus, on Freemasonry, is the greatest papal condemnation of Freemasonry. Leo XIII died in 1903, which opened the door for another conclave, and something frightening almost happened. Cardinal Mariano Rampolo entered the conclave favored to be the next pope, but when it was discovered that he had a close affinity with the French Freemasons, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria used his traditional prerogative as Holy Roman Emperor to veto Cardinal Rampolo's candidacy. In further rounds of voting, the papacy was offered to Giuseppe Melchiorre Sarto, whom we now know as Pope St. Pius X. Pope St. Pius X understood the agenda of Freemasonry as well as its ties to the communist threat, and he knew well Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. His goal was to educate the faithful about the errors of modernism, communism, and false nationalism. And that way he felt he could prevent these errors from further infiltrating the church and harming Catholics. Even though influential people in society were saying that the Catholic Church was out of touch and needed to modernize in order to relate to the current culture and society, Pope St. Paul X would negotiate with the advocates of modern culture and contemporary philosophies. Wouldn't negotiate. I thought I said would for a second. Instead, he issued a decree entitled Lamentabili Sane, which condemned the errors of the modernists. He followed that up with his famous encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis against modernism, which condemns the evils of modernism. One of the results of this encyclical was that all priests were required to take the oath of modernism. In 1967, the Vatican replaced this oath with a different profession of faith. Just took it out, because in 1967 everything terrible happened. After Pope St. Pius X died in 1914, Pope Benedict the 15th was elected. What? Okay. I was thinking 16th. Pope Benedict the 15th was elected and would reign until 1922. Whereas Leo XIII and St. Pius X dealt with Freemasonry and modernism, Benedict XV had to contend with World War I and communism, which took power in Russia in 1917 during his reign. This was also a time of great change in women's fashions. In 1910, the Archbishop of Paris led a campaign against women's immodest fashions. Think about that for a moment. What were women wearing in 1910 that was so bad? Campaign against immodesty in 1910. Oh my gosh. Now priests are letting people wear... 5 years later, the church released a general pastoral directive stating that women must be dressed decently at Mass. Yeah, why can't they have that kind of courage now? It's ridiculous. That the priest may refuse them entrance into the church if they are not dressed properly. The fact is that in comparison to the modest fashions of just a decade or two prior to this, the new fashions displayed an alarming trend toward immodesty that was, all things considered, simply unacceptable. Viewed from our perspective, one has to wonder whether or not the popes were privy to the plan of the fashion designers for them to have blown the whistle on the new fashions so early in the game, historically speaking. Yeah, they probably knew. Imagine the very conservative styles at that time period before the flapper craze of the 1920s. that saw short skirts to the knees and sleeveless dresses. Obviously, fashions were already changing drastically and not for the better. On May 13th, 1917, Our Lady of Fatima first appeared to 3 children in Portugal. She would appear on the 13th of the next 5 months and would later tell one of the children, Blessed Jacinta Marto, that more souls go to hell for sins of the flesh than for any other reason. This innocent young child may not have fully realized what sins of the flesh meant, but the Baltimore Catechism teaches us that these sins fall under the 6th and 9th commandment. Our Lady of Fatima also said that certain fashions would be introduced that would offend our Lord very much. Jacinta commented later that people who serve God should not follow current fashion trends. Jacinta also said that the Church has no fashions and that our Lord is always the same. Also in 1917, the young St. Maximilian Kolbe, starving, in place of another man voluntarily. He didn't have to even say a word. He just said, let me starve instead. Witnessing the 200th anniversary celebrations of Freemasonry in Rome. The celebrations featured banners depicting St. Michael being trodden underfoot by Satan. Slogans such as Satan will rule on Vatican Hill and the Pope will serve as his errand boy. Oh gosh, I'm going to start crying. St. Maximilian's comments that these demonstrations simply carried out the Masonic rule of action. Destroy all teaching about God, especially Catholic teaching. The saint continues, the Freemasons follow this rule. Above all, Catholicism can be overcome not by logical argument, but by corrupted morals. Corruption of morals? Where have we heard that strategy before? That same year, St. Maximilian Kolbe founded the Knights of the Immaculata to fight the forces of Satan by spreading devotion to Mary Immaculate. Slacks appeared on the fashion runways of Paris in 1920. 1920, the next year, Pope Benedict XV expressed his shock that women would embrace the current fashion trends and styles of dancing. He wrote, one cannot sufficiently deplore the blindness of so many women of every age and condition made foolish by desire to please. They do not see to what a degree the indecency of their clothing shocks every honest man and offends God. Most of them would formerly have blushed for those toilets outfits, as for a grave fault against Christian modesty. Now it does not suffice for them to exhibit them on the public thoroughfares. They do not fear to cross the threshold of churches, to assist at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and even to bear the seducing food of shameful passions to the Eucharistic table, where one receives the heavenly author of purity. And we speak not of those exotic and barbarous dances recently imported into fashionable circles, one more shocking than the other. One cannot imagine anything more suitable for banishing all the remains of modesty. The Bible says over and over again, be modest, be pure. In the 1920s, women's clothing styles were taking on a radical and revolutionary new look. For the first time in history, women of refinement were seen wearing sleeves above the elbow and hemlines that crawled up to the knee. Remember that Masonic directive, first undress up to the elbow, then up to the knees, then arms and legs completely uncovered, later the upper part of the chest, the shoulders, etc. First time in history. Women have always been modest, like regular, good, moral women, like family women. And like the only women that have not been modest have been like, slave women or prostitutes. Or in 1928, Pope Pius XI wrote, there is a sad forgetfulness of Christian modesty, especially in the life and dress of women. Worldly Catholics and secular society responded by saying that modesty in dress was regulated by customs and styles of time. Worldly Catholics. styles of time, place, and circumstances. They encouraged women to ignore these statements from the church. Instead, they said it was society and culture that should dictate what is modest and appropriate. But in their publications, Freemasons had revealed their motive and plan. The following quote bears repeating. Religion does not fear the dagger's point. We already read this earlier. Nudism and dress. Avoid too much reaction. Use a methodical manner. Uncover everything. If you look at the fashion trends since 1928, you can see that styles have very closely followed this strategy. At that time, garments were already up to the elbows and knees. The year 1928 was also the beginning of Pope Pius XI's Modesty crusade. It makes one think that he may have known about the plot of Freemasonry. Wow, the Pope was calling modesty, modesty. He probably knew. I'll read about the Modesty crusade in a minute. I'll take a little break and have a part 3.